Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Employability Lab 2023. I'm super excited to be hosting the lab today alongside the wonderful Claire from Handshake. My name's Emma Moore. I'm Head of University Partnerships at Gradconsult. I'm just going to start by saying a few words about Gradconsult, a quick reminder of what we do for those of you who don't know. So, Gradconsult are a talent consultancy. We work in the space between universities and graduate recruitment teams. Since we established the business in 2012, we've worked with over 70% of UK universities and lots of international clients as well. In the main, our work with universities focuses on three main areas: research, strategy, and consultancy. So this is working as a trusted partner with university teams who are delivering change. This might be a big change around the whole delivery model, or something more focused around placement or employer engagement, for example. We also offer training and L&D for career services and academics on a huge range of topics, some topics that are popular at the moment: innovative student engagement and embedding employability, and the power of peer-to-peer. But we do a whole range of different topics with lots of different career services and teams in universities across the UK. We also offer student and graduate development. We're finding this is the demand for this is really growing at the moment as careers teams are struggling to recruit. So we come in and run sessions with students and graduates on a huge range of different topics, future skills sessions around things like commercial awareness, resilience, personal branding, but also experiential days like Be the Recruiter and Innovation Hackathon. So that's sort of us in a nutshell. I'll hand over to Claire so that she can introduce herself too.
Thanks, Emma. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening if you're watching the recording after today. As Emma said, welcome to Employability Lab 2023. For those of you I've not had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Claire Adams and I look after education strategy for Handshake. Prior to joining Handshake, I spent over a decade in higher education and further education, primarily in careers, student support and student representation. But just to briefly introduce Handshake a little for those of you who don't know anything about us. Handshake was started by these fabulous three students on the screen whilst they were at university, trying to figure out what they were going to do after university. They spent a lot of time with the careers professionals that worked at their university. Julie Way was a particular influence on their sort of career exploration, and encouraged them to kind of broaden their horizons for actions and sort of enhance what they thought about in relation to their next steps. And as a result of that experience and that relationship, they realized that the technology that careers professionals, students and employers actually were using could be drastically improved. So they set out on a bit of a mission, I would say, to kind of change that as computer science and software engineering students, as I'm sure you can't tell from this picture. Today, Handshake brings all the tools that you would imagine from a career management system within a university, but blends it with a community and network that supports students with those crucial relationships as they move from education to employment. So all of the traditional tools that you would imagine, so appointment management, virtual and in-person event management, experiential learning management, email marketing, journeys, awards, those kinds of things, but also the ability to message peer-to-peer, alumni, connect with employers, read profiles and reviews about the kinds of employers that recruit students like them. So it's really about creating that dedicated network and community around a student as they transition from education to employment, placing careers professionals like all of you in the heart of that network and community to offer you really unique insights into how students are engaging in that transition. And ultimately, Handshake is really about amplifying the work of careers professionals, continuing to innovate and deliver a product that students love to use every day, because that's where technology can add value, to be honest. Some of you may recognise the video on the right hand side of this screen. This is part of the product vision that we presented before Christmas, and I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who was involved in the research prior to Christmas around bringing this kind of product vision to life, whether you attended a one-to-one or you attended one of the roadshows that we ran across the UK. It's really talking and listening to all of you that is the most important part of our product development research, just like it was for Scott, Ben and Garrett in those early days with Julie Way. So a huge thank you to everyone from the whole Handshake team for being part of that prior to Christmas.
So I think without further ado, we're ready to start our first session. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Aranee Manoharan, who is Director of Student Success at King's College London. Aranee is an undoubted expert on all things inclusivity and especially how this relates to employability. So I'm really excited to hear her speak this morning. So welcome, Aranee, and I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Emma. And hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Aranee, and I'm really pleased to be joining you all today at what looks to be a hugely interesting event. I am currently Director of Student Success at King's College London, and up until very recently, I led the Careers and Employability Service here as well. In addition to this, I'm also a consultant and facilitator working in the areas of EDI, inclusive service design, and inclusive leadership and management development. Prior to this, I worked in student engagement, facilitating community-based learning, both in and out of the curriculum. And I started my HE career in teaching undergraduate international relations, as my own research interests focus on human rights and addressing ethnic conflict. And when I was asked to do the keynote for this event, I asked, what topic would you like me to speak on? And they said I could do anything, but it should blow people's minds. And I really feel like that's perhaps setting too high a bar for my talk today. And I really want to manage expectations in relation to this. The unusually hectic nature of this month has meant that I haven't prepared slides for you. So I hope you'll be okay with just looking at my face whilst I kind of step onto my soapbox for the next half an hour to state my views on the nexus of education, inclusion and employability within the curriculum in what is a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous 21st century. And so with that, then I want to pose the question of, what is the purpose of a higher education in 2023 and in the future? And of course, the answer depends on who you ask. We know that the rates of students entering HE continue to remain high. The populations we see today are also the most diverse, ethnically, socioeconomically, and in all the other ways that exist as well, even whilst fees and maintenance loans mean that these students leave with a minimum of 50k debt. So, for me, I think a key driver for this increase in HE engagement is, of course, social mobility, as higher education is still seen as the primary vehicle by which one can improve their life's prospects through securing a good job, whatever that means. Now, this is certainly the messaging that we receive from the government and by extension, the Office for Students who measure the value of a university education through its graduate outcomes. I know we all know that in this space here. And of course, we see that as degree programs that are not achieving the expected outcomes are being threatened with closure. However, I think many colleagues in the university environment, and including perhaps some of you here today, are often philosophically opposed to equating the value of higher education with employment. In my coaching and consulting work with academic staff in particular, people lament on how students these days aren't even interested in the subject that they're studying. Where's the love of learning? People say. And I think as someone who loves learning myself, I completely understand how this can feel demoralizing for those who've committed their lives to researching and teaching in their fields. However, I can't help but feel that these kinds of comments also sort of highlight the immense privilege that exists within the university setting. These colleagues likely didn't have to pay 9k a year in fees to spend time exploring their love for their subject, and they perhaps also didn't have to juggle the varying priorities that students of today do, such as financial and caring responsibilities. And so in the context of such huge debts and little time, students of today are strategic in their engagement, directing their limited focus on the compulsory aspects of the university environment. And their expectation for value for money, I know a phrase that we all immensely dislike, but if we think about it in this context, as the expectation of HE as being an investment in a better future, I think it's a reasonable one. If you're going to carry such huge student debts, you would hope that there's more on the horizon in addition to the greater knowledge and understanding of your field. And I think really for universities to best serve all of our students, then it's essential that we rethink our assumptions about how our university education and curriculum should be designed and delivered. So in my previous institution at Kingston University, I worked closely with academic teams, and I would always start by asking 3 questions. What is the world that we're preparing students for? What do they need to be able to do in this world? And what is it that we want them to be able to do? And these questions always kind of provided that good framework to understand what perhaps is the purpose of their disciplinary curriculum today and moving forward. So if we take that first question then, what is the world that graduates of today and tomorrow are going into? Well, Barnett and Coates speak of the 21st century as being characterized by heightened levels of complexity and uncertainty, fluidity, fuzziness, instability, fragility, unpredictability, indeterminacy, turbulence, changeability, and contestability. And we can say that they're all synonyms, but the beauty of the English language is that they all mean slightly different things, and they're all increasingly true of the world we live in. They actually wrote that back in 2005, now nearly 18 years ago. And if we think about how the world has changed in that time, how we've seen a pandemic sort of change the world across the globe in a moment, how we've seen technologies and industries in that time both die and be born, I think it's easy to see the truth in that characterization. And so if this is the world that we're preparing students for, and I believe it is, then this leads to the question of what do they need to be able to do in such an environment? We are amidst the 4th industrial revolution, and someone I saw in the chat spoke about ChatGPT, unprecedented speed in which technology is evolving and impacting our lives. In such a context, discipline-specific skills will erode rapidly, and what we may teach as technical capabilities will be obsolete in 2 to 3 years' time, if not before. And therefore, what our graduates need to be able to do really is have the transferable capabilities that will enable them to not only effectively foresee and adapt to change, but also potentially lead it. So if that's what they have to do, then what is it we wish for them? What is it that we would like them to be able to do in this world? And I think the majority of us don't work in higher education for the paycheck, let's face it. In my encounters, I'm always surrounded by those who have a real wanting to make a difference in the world through our work with students. And for me, the purpose of a higher education and of the university as a whole is really to serve the local and global communities that we're all a part of by cultivating our students to recognize their mantle of responsibility to become informed and contributing members of society. And as such, the learning process should not just enable students to evaluate information critically, which is what I think we generally focus on when we think about a degree education, but to convert that knowledge into action, to solve problems by working with people from different backgrounds and cultures, by combining entrepreneurial creativity with technological know-how and humanistic values and vision, so that we can find solutions locally and globally to the challenges we're all facing. And whilst that seems like a lofty endeavor, perhaps, I think it's something I believe we should be striving for in our work with all of our students. But to be able to achieve this, then it is vital that universities recognize this future and prepare its students accordingly by facilitating the development of relevant knowledge, skills, and experiences. This will become their toolkit for success arming them with the capability to self-assess, be curious, look into the depths of challenges, recognize opportunities, and continually grow their capability. And therefore, really, employability in this context is about life skills, the ability to wield knowledge and take action confidently as they need to, faced with whatever it is that they're going to be faced with. And Harvey talks about a really great way of talking about this, which is the emphasis is less on employ and more on ability. It's about developing those critical reflective abilities with a view to empowering and enhancing the individual, so that employment becomes a byproduct of this enabling process. And I really believe this is what we should really mean when we talk about employability in the university environment. And indeed, I think it has to become an essential aspect of what a university education and disciplinary curriculum delivers. So at this point then, I want to take a couple of minutes to point out a side note on inclusion and inclusive practice. Now, when we think about the diverse cohorts we serve and the purpose of the university and our higher education to support these students, to navigate and make an impact in the world, we need to also consider how we do this for every student. You know, since 2020, we know the inclusion agenda within the sector has really accelerated. But as someone who's been contributing to the space of EDI in the public sector for over 18 years now, I'm continually frustrated by how limited our approaches are. I think too often in HE, inclusive practice is understood as being about bespoke programs for minoritized groups. It's why we see the plethora of small-scale programs or initiatives established for particular cohorts of students across student-facing departments. And of course, we see this as a growing aspect of careers as well. And whilst I recognize the good intentions behind such initiatives, solely focusing on these types of activities without assessing and addressing structural inequities within the department and the university environment means we're actually taking a student deficit approach. What we're really saying is that the student is lacking in some way, and that this enhancement project is going to give them the thing that they need to do better, rather than recognizing how the university environment and perhaps even our own departments are disadvantaging and advantaging certain students to lead to inequities in outcomes. So I often talk about with colleagues the concept of inclusive by design. And what this really means is that each of us as individuals and teams ensure that whatever it is that we're facilitating, whether it's workshops and events or indeed the disciplinary curriculum, that they are designed in a way that allows students to be able to access, engage with, contribute to, and benefit from them. To be able to do this, we need to examine and address structural inequities by examining and addressing the structures, processes, and behaviors of the service to build a really robust and inclusive foundation to all the work that we deliver. And people can often really tie themselves up in knots thinking about how they support every intersectional identity that a student may have. And that's really not what inclusive by design is referring to. The concept for me has a few different theoretical underpinnings, including culturally responsive practice and capability approach, but a core one of which is also universal design. And I really want to share an excerpt from the Center of Universal Design, which I think is amazing because it's so simple in how it talks about it, which is that the environments that we create and facilitate should be designed to meet the needs of all people who wish to use it. It is a fundamental condition of good design. If an environment is accessible, usable, convenient, and a pleasure to use, everyone benefits. By considering the diverse needs and abilities of all throughout the design process, universal design creates products, services, and environments that meet people's needs. Simply put, universal design is good design. And essentially, that's what we need to be thinking about when we think about how we make the everyday work that we do inclusive. So to do this in practice then, rather than thinking about all of the breadth of diversity that exists, actually a good starting point for this work, and that I encourage my colleagues to do, is to really think about our most marginalized student and user and see what their journey to and through our work looks and feels like for them. And to even be able to do this, it's really essential for universities, departments, and each of us as individuals to understand who our students are, what are their priorities, how do they want to engage, who do they want to engage with, and what might prevent them from engaging with everything that it is we want them to engage with. And I think this understanding will really allow us to ensure that the core of what we deliver, the fundamentals of it, are inclusive at a structural level. And it's usually at this point that people then challenge me and say, but what about the individual and individual needs? And my response is that this is not an either-or situation. Once we have ensured that our core delivery is robust in this way, then we can think about all of our students and users. And this is where the enhancement activities and personalized experiences come to the fore and become truly beneficial for all students. Without this strong foundation, the enhancement activity is literally a tick box exercise, and it won't help make those sustainable changes for the better that we really should be aiming to achieve through our work. Okay, side note over with. Going back then to how we can prepare students with the knowledge, skills, and experiences they need to navigate and thrive in a VUCA 21st century. In a way that's inclusive by design, we really need to examine the fundamental structure that students navigate at the university. And this is, of course, their curriculum. Now, the notion of inclusive curriculum has been around for a number of years, far longer than we perhaps realize, but has gained huge traction since 2020, especially in those universities, such as the Russell Group, that perhaps didn't focus on this area before. And in the literature, inclusive curriculum is understood in a range of ways, the most prominent of which are, firstly, to access the curriculum for differently abled students, and secondly, is decolonizing the curriculum to address differential outcomes. And both aspects are really important advancements in curriculum design thinking. However, I would say that what's really lacking in the literature and in practice actually is the fact that all of this work is preoccupied with students effectively engaging with and achieving their degrees, but really has got nothing to do with the role of the curriculum in preparing students for the rigors of life afterwards. And I think it's increasingly clear that the omission of employability from the inclusive curriculum and gender is really problematic, actually, as the data shows all of us the interrelated nature between attainment and graduate outcomes. And therefore, if there is differential attainment, there is also likely differential outcomes, limiting those graduates who are often coming from the most disadvantaged sections of society in their ability to make an impact for themselves and in the world. And therefore, I think it's really essential that the inclusive curriculum and employability agendas really come together, because in my mind, they're essentially the same thing. A truly inclusive curriculum is one that not only enables students to progress year on year and attain a good degree, but also prepares them for their transition into their lives after university and beyond. So I think we all probably know and understand the usual ways employability is embedded within the university. And I call this an additive approach. You know, it's usually something coming from the outside and being added on to the degree program through, for example, optional skills modules or work-based learning modules that students can choose. You know, in the past couple of years, we've seen more of those things becoming mandatory as well, a part of the program, but still additive because they are not designed or delivered as part of the disciplinary curriculum. You know, a reminder again that students of today are strategic learners, and really those who would benefit most from these types of optional modules don't always engage because they don't recognize the benefit in relation to their degrees. And even if they are compulsory, they still generally pass, fail, and sit outside of the disciplinary nature of the curriculum. And so, like with academic skills modules, I think they're notorious for having high student disengagement. And really, that's why I've always advocated for employability to be integrated and embedded into the curriculum in a programmatic way, where a course team, so the academic team, is really the one to design it in across the whole student journey of their program. And this begins with the course team thinking about answering those 3 questions that I kind of posed earlier and spoke about, so that they can really identify what it is they want their graduates to leave with. So they can think about how those skills and capabilities are introduced through the core disciplinary learning at level 4 in the first year, how they're developed upon at level 5 in the second year, and then consolidated at level 6 in the third year through the use of a range of inclusive pedagogies and assessments that not only allow students to actively engage with their disciplinary learning, but also develop a range of skills and experiences that will become a part of that toolkit that they can use throughout their lives. So having started my career teaching undergraduates, I've always approached embedding employability from the perspective of the student and the academic educator. And the reality is an inclusive curriculum that enables progression, attainment, and effective transition into their lives beyond is not anything special. Just as the Centre for Universal Design said, it's literally the implementation of good practice in teaching and learning of the disciplinary curriculum. And this means really thinking about teaching and learning practice, pedagogies and assessments that we use to teach in all of our modules across the degree program, and how they support students developing those skills, competencies and capabilities. Now, a little bit then on teaching and learning practice. Inquiry-based approaches are regarded as high-impact pedagogies that not only enable students to gain disciplinary knowledge, but also provide them with significant experiences that facilitate the application of theoretical learning in authentic scenarios, develop a range of 21st century skills and competencies, and expose students to potential career pathways that they may never have considered before. And I think such significant experiences are an inclusive alternative to internships and placements, which I know universities are hugely preoccupied with because they've been proven. We know that they're awesome, right? We know internships and placements can have a huge impact on students, but they are ultimately not accessible to all students, and they're not scalable to all students, especially those from disadvantaged contexts. Even if they are through work-based learning modules, and therefore actually focusing on the everyday learning practice of the degree is where we can have the greatest impact for the most students. So inquiry-based approaches such as problem-based learning, design thinking, and authentic assessments all ask students to access and practice higher order skills to solve real-world problems by connecting and applying their previous learning to create new ways of thinking and doing, and really supporting the cultivation of entrepreneurial capability, which is really vital to navigating a VUCA environment and a VUCA future that we've talked about already. And these pedagogies and assessments can be further enhanced through the engagement with the real world, where students are asked to apply that learning to provide real solutions to real problems that impact real people through engagement, for example, with community-based organizations. And importantly, I think, and perhaps controversially, I hope not, this work really needs to be led by academic teams, supported, through all of the expertise that professional services staff have and provide. It's the course team who really need to think about what does a future-ready graduate look like from their program, what is it that they need, and how this is going to be achieved at each level of study. And also about how they're going to continuously maintain and improve that as the world does change rapidly around us. So I'm going to wrap up there. I hope that's okay. It's sort of my meanderings and wanderings across these different areas. I hope it's been interesting or useful, or I hope it's made you think about what you may want to be doing in your own context. And I hope there are quite a few questions to explore this further. I think the main ones generally come on how do we do this, and if that is the case, I'd be happy to say a little bit more.
Thanks, Aranee. That was fabulously interesting. I know I've written about 3 or 4 pages of notes, and I'm sure everybody else has been doing the same. We have got some great questions in. So I'll kick off with one from Charlotte Paul, which is, what would be your advice in embedding careers content in subjects where skills development inclusion can be quite nuanced, such as English, history, etc.?
Yeah, so I worked closely with humanities-based programs in my previous institution, and I think colleagues are actually really open to thinking about what this looks like in that space. And I think it's always to look at it from their perspective. So the fact is that, you know, graduates from these types of programs can literally do anything. And therefore, it's really important that when we do our work with those academic colleagues and integrating employability, I think it's to do it from a perspective that makes sense to them. So even my team say to me, how do we get careers content into a degree program? It's like, that's probably the wrong way around of thinking about it. I would say, start with the degree program. Like, what is it that's being delivered currently through that English degree, right? What are the different kinds of modules? How are they teaching on those programs? What are the assessments? Now, the assumption, let's say stereotypically, is that it's a wholly essay-based degree program. I mean, what is it that students are gaining through doing perhaps 10 different essays or, you know, across the degree program? What is it that they are showcasing to the academic team, and what is it they're gaining through that process? And I think rather than thinking about putting careers content in, it's actually having a conversation around, maybe we do something slightly differently around the ways we teach and assess the program that will provide that kind of indirect skills development, but that we then make explicit to students, right? So that they can understand through this assessment activity, you're actually gaining a range of these skills. And therefore, actually, it's a different way of thinking about it. It's not about necessarily having a careers workshop in the English program, although I think that also can be a conversation. But I think if we go in and start in that place, it can be a bit like, it just doesn't fit. So I don't know how I can do that. So I think it's always to start from the perspective of the academic and the academic team.
That's great, Aranee. I think it's always start with the programme, isn't it? And it's those relationships that careers teams can build with academics that are really, really key. Another question, sort of following on from this, from Amy Child. How do we get students to explore career options within their programme? We see students focus on one route or career, and this ends up putting a lot of pressure on them to find the right thing rather than to take a more exploratory approach.
Yeah, and I think this is especially the case in certain disciplinary areas where there may be a defined outcome, and also where students may be, you know, encouraged by members of their community and their families as well to pursue certain kind of trajectories. But I think so this is where level 4, the first year, if we're taking the undergraduate scenario, is really, really important. And if we think about, you know, how do we induct students into a program, and what are the kind of core things that students need in that first year, and really working with the academic team to think about that more holistically. And so, for example, when I was doing this work directly with academic teams, we would talk about the first year a lot. We would talk about what is it the support they needed from us as a careers service in this first year. And we would also provide our guidance around what were the kinds of things that students really needed to be exposed to. So, you know, many universities talk about kind of this discovery phase, and we've all, many of us now have careers registration where we kind of monitor those things as well, right? Like what phase of career thinking are students at? And actually in the first year, students think they know what it is they're going to do often. And you find it's actually in their second year at level 5, they've gone back a careers thinking stage to discover again, because they're like, actually, after that first year, they've realized all of their assumptions about life and career and their degree discipline and stuff is perhaps not the reality, and they've kind of gone back to being slightly more confused and needing to explore options. So I think it's just about working with the academic team to kind of create space or opportunities for that exploration. And obviously the really good practice is where that's introduced through the program itself. So I remember working with they were called creative industries or a media kind of studies program, which was based in the humanities. And it was actually in one of the core level 4 first year modules, where kind of exposure to different roles within media was kind of part of the core learning. They had to understand the breadth of the media landscape, and through their learning and their assessment, they were able to explore different kind of career pathways. And that could be done in a range of different ways depending on the discipline, but it's about getting that buy-in from the kind of academic team to do that, which I realize is probably the hardest first step.
Great. So another question here from Duncan McComb. Do you have any best practice on helping academics work with careers teams, industry, service providers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is always understanding. So if it's an individual academic, like what is their priority and motivation, and then tapping into that to connect your agenda to it, right? Like from a careers perspective, we want to be getting like an employer to do a guest talk on team working rather than perhaps a careers person doing it or the academic doing it, right? It'd be amazing to get someone from industry to deliver that kind of workshop in the actual curriculum to give them that kind of real world perspective. However, it has to be done in a way that the academic feels confident and comfortable with. And therefore, I always start off with that conversation with the individual to understand where are they coming from, what are their challenges right now, and then how does what I can do or my team can do or my service can do support them in that endeavor. And it's the same when you work at an academic team level as well, or a departmental level, because our academic colleagues are hugely stretched. They are being burdened with kind of putting every single thing into the curriculum, and all of mental health and well-being is one of those things, sustainability is one of those things, employability is one of those things, inclusion, and they're all being spoken about separately by different teams and colleagues across the institution. And I sort of think we need to recognize from their perspective how overwhelming that can be, and especially when they have a range of things they need to be dealing with as well. So it's always to begin there. That is the best advice. Like the work that I did at Kingston started off with individual conversations and coaching really of the academic to grow their confidence, to trust in us that we're there to support them. And then once we've gained their trust, they're far more open to being creative and exploring the potential in their programs. But yeah, it's a journey, and it has to be a consistent one across the department. So if you're a careers service working with academics across different faculties, you need to have a consistent approach so that whoever they're working with, there's no single point of failure. It's not going to live and die on your individual relationship with that person, but that actually it's built into your ways of working with them.
I think that's so true. Any conversation that starts with how can I make your life easier is always going to end well. A question now around being inclusive by design. Can you share an example of an initiative that you've come across in the sector that really did this really well?
So I think my kind of point around inclusive by design is it's not an initiative. So the point of inclusive by design is that you're just looking at your day-to-day. And I think we can get really caught up by initiatives. So for me, it's around looking at your whole service design and thinking about how does a student, and perhaps your most marginalized student or user, how do they find you? How do they then have their first engagement with you? And then what does the whole how do they kind of engage with you and through you to achieve the things you want them to be able to achieve? So it's a holistic approach from that context to create a really strong foundation upon which then initiatives can be developed to suit the needs of different kind of student groups. So it's an everyday approach to working inclusive by design. That's what it is. It's not an initiative in and of itself. And so we do need to think about things like one-to-ones and the core bread and butter of what we think careers do. And I delivered a workshop on inclusive by design recently, and they said, you need to give an example, Aranee. And I was like, we're really preoccupied with the notion of one-to-ones in the careers world. It's the way we've always done it, and I totally get why. There's huge amounts of benefit to it. But it could be considered, an argument could be made that one-to-ones are not culturally, for some people, something that they'd want to engage with. We have many students who feel far more comfortable engaging with a careers professional with their friends, for example, or in a group environment. And that's where we may say workshops exist, but actually having the same one-to-one support, the guidance piece, in a small group setting with the people that they trust, friendship groups, so that it's not all on them, but it's also not exposed in a public environment, that can be really helpful. But actually, there can be real challenge from careers colleagues in kind of rethinking that model. So this is where kind of culturally responsive practice comes in, and thinking about the fact that, not all of our students come from an individualistic perspective, which is very kind of Western. For them, there is solace and comfort in community. And so kind of being able to engage and access the careers department through their own community is something that can be really helpful. So for me, inclusive by design is also thinking about it from that perspective as well, challenging some of our assumptions or the ways that we may want to engage with things.
I think that's really important. I think it's really interesting when we take things in our practice that we've done forever and then look at them through a different perspective. I think sometimes that's when the really interesting things emerge around what we do. Yeah. A question here from Caroline Darrell. Aranee said, think from the most marginalised and consider their journey to design curriculum programmes. How are most marginalised defined?
I think it's dependent on your context and the students that you have. So this is not a one-size-fits-all type situation. But if we take a London university, for example, where you just see students from all walks of life, so you would then think about it from, that student that would be considered most marginalised in that situation. So a care leaver from a low socioeconomic background, with a disability, perhaps on the neurodiverse spectrum, from an ethnic minority heritage. And then you'd then understand the complexity of life that student has. Now it may feel or sound reductive, but it's actually the opposite of that, because you recognize the huge amount of complexity that can potentially exist with any one student that may not be visible to us. So if we think about it from that way and think about that persona, we then think about, well, what is it that student will need, or what is it that student is facing that we need to be able to recognize so that they can really see the support available, think it resonates with them, and think that they have the confidence to actually go ahead and utilize it to then be able to explore and vision and then achieve the things that they want to do. So that's what I mean by that. But the context is different from a London-based institution to one, for example, in the Northeast or any other kind of different context. So you need to understand your students to be able to recognize what your most marginalized user who they may be.
Some great advice there on understanding our own students. And I think thinking about this, what do you think about involving students in the design?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the student voice and then student kind of input into the design and delivery of whatever it is that we're looking at, whether it is our own careers provision, or whether it is the curriculum, is really important. But I also think there's a burden attached to that. So in the same way that EDI shouldn't be led by those who are negatively impacted by inequities only. So you know how race equity shouldn't only be led by people from minoritized racial groups, right? It needs to be led and recognized and supported by everybody. I think it's the same in this situation. The onus shouldn't be on students alone. They need support and structure and scaffolding in that process, because you don't know what you don't know. They bring huge amounts of lived experience, insight, but they also may not recognize or understand what the wider world can be like. And therefore, it's important that whenever we're bringing students into the design and delivery of things, that we properly support them with the information they need, so that they can then make those informed kind of decisions and approaches to how we're doing things. And I also think it's important to recognize when we're doing student co-creation, that who are the students that are putting themselves forward for this, and how do we actually ensure that there is a breadth of experiences in that group. So it's not just the most confident and the one with the most time that engages, but actually we get that breadth of experience coming into and feeding into whatever it is we're looking to design.
I think it's so important that we get that piece around student voice right. There are so many ways and pitfalls along the way with trying to do that. I think it's a really interesting area of work at the moment. We've got a lot of university people on the call today, but we've also got some employers. So we've got a question here from an employer. Any advice for employers trying to diversify recruitment?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, it's for us in the university as well, in how we support employers to recognize that. So I think there's a real focus on the employer side on the recruitment itself. So how do you create inclusive recruitment pathways? How can we, and there's good practice in that area. You can think about the various actual practices, recruitment practices that can be put in place to ensure a more diverse pipeline into an organization. But I think what's really important that employers need to learn from universities, and for example, widening participation strategies in universities, that it can't just be about access. So it can't just be about getting more diverse graduates into your organization, but there's that whole piece around how the working environment is inclusive and supportive and enables that diverse group to then continue to progress and thrive within your organization. So it's a whole staff life cycle approach at that point. It's not, they're not students anymore, but it's a life cycle piece there. And I just think it is about looking at culture and so workplace culture and how you demystify things. So I don't know which employer this is, whether they're a huge institute, like a huge organization, or whether they're a SME, but it's to really kind of think about what is it that you are showcasing your culture is, and then what is their experience of that through the recruitment process as well. And I think just thinking about it from a user experience perspective, for a lack of a better term, I guess, but if you're a graduate that's perhaps not savvy in understanding the recruitment environment, I think we need to take it from that perspective. They're just not savvy about that. What do they need from the employer to say, hey, I'm going to apply here and I'm going to do my best to progress and I'm going to actually stay? Because we know there's big attrition as well amongst new grads in roles, and we need to understand, employers need to think about why that attrition may exist. So why might they be leaving? So not gone in too much depth. I think there is good practice around inclusive recruitment strategies and practices, but I also think it has to be about those first couple of years at least. What is the experience of that grad? Because that's the only way that the employer then can really benefit from having diverse perspectives and experiences as well.
I think that's so true. I think, the same as universities, we focused on that first key transition point, and there are lots of things that we need to do going forward and to look at the whole sort of journey and the whole time that the student or grad spends in the business. I think we've got time for one last question before we wrap up for the break. So final question from Rebecca Walters. How do you think that we as career development professionals can get academics to buy in to make these fairly big curriculum changes when their focus tends to be very much elsewhere?
So I'm always like, I believe in holism. You need an institutional approach. So you as an individual, if your university has not said this is a priority, are not going to be able to make that change yourself, okay? And that's me being really like with my head of service hat on, like I always say to my colleagues who want to do so much good through their work and then face that kind of challenge. The fact is if that institution is not saying this is important to us, then our ability to make that kind of large scale change that needs to happen is always going to be limited. So first, give yourself a break is what I'm saying in relation to that. But the second, I think, is like I've said kind of previously, it's to, if you do have the option, if you feel like there's a potentially open door to making some larger changes, it is dependent on kind of doing it from the perspective of the academic and the course team. What are their challenges, and how does the solutions you'll suggest, how do the suggestions you're making, how do they become a solution for them in addressing those challenges? That's the best way to get buy-in from my experience. I also want to mention very quickly, there was a point around kind of staff from marginalized communities or minoritized communities, and I very much agree with that point. The careers profession as a whole isn't as diverse as it could possibly be, and it is really important that we recognize why that is, and we think about how we as in our profession think about how we diversify the space so that we can better serve one another and our students and our institutions, and in our departments kind of utilize that expertise as well. But it shouldn't, again, like I said with the student piece, it shouldn't be their problem. So it shouldn't be your minoritized staff member to be leading whatever activity you're doing to support minoritized students. It's all of our responsibilities, every single person, and therefore it's really important we support one another in that way as well. Just want to end with that.
Amazing. I think that's a super important point to end on as well. Well, thank you so much, Aranee. That has been brilliant.